India had gone nuclear in 1998, but our doctrine got published a little later. And that doctrine was a well thought through doctrine. It was based on understanding how the nuclear deterrence had worked ever since the first bomb was dropped in Japan. Nuclear weapons were understood after the first two drops in Japan have never been used again. Nuclear weapons have been always for the use for political purposes and not for military purposes. And to that extent, the India's thought process on nuclear doctrine was very clear that we do not want the first use doctrine to be put in place. It has certain advantages. First advantage was it brought in certain amount of certainty in the thought process. Secondly, it brought in a larger degree of political control because the military had no part to play because it was not used to be used for war fighting. And third is the lesser numbers were required because once the nuclear attack takes place, then the retaliation would take place. And retaliation has to be sufficient enough to cause such damage which will become unacceptable to that country. And it was a very well thought through process, keeping in mind our own situations and the lessons of history learned from other nations.
I would say there are three factors that led to India adopting no first use, and this was because of the unique circumstances in which India tested in 1998 and what happened thereafter. The most important factor, which is largely bandied around by people, is India's strategic culture. The fact that India has never been a country to opt for first use of force for resolution of any problem. That was one of the reasons as to why India went in for a no first use. It seemed to come automatically from the strategic culture of the country. The second factor, which is often talked about, is the political circumstances after India's test, the kind of criticism that India came in for, the sanctions which were in place, and therefore when the nuclear doctrine came out in 1999, a lot of people felt that this was for earning political brownie points because it seemed like the ethically or morally the correct thing to do. But I think the third factor, which is the most important and which is the least recognized as to why India went in for no first use, is coming from the military logic of the concept of no first use. Having gone through the experience of the Cold War period in which we saw the two superpowers actually going through war game exercises in which the use of nuclear weapon never yielded anything. And there were several nuclear strategists in India who were studying this entire experience. And Mr. K. Subramaniam, Air Commodore Jasjeet Singh, the people who were involved in the making of the doctrine understood the military logic of a no first use. And this is I think the most important criteria as to why India went in for no first use, but this is the least understood of the three factors that I've tried to explain.
India has been a very consistent proponent of nuclear disarmament in general, and there is a proposal on the Indian side also in line with the international forums for universal nuclear disarmament. Now, to support that particular aspect, no first use is a very powerful sort of option which India has exercised, and to ensure that it does not exceed and does not project an aggressive or offensive image to the international community as far as the nuclear dimension is concerned. Of course, we have to go in for the nuclear option or taking on the nuclear weapons because of the regional as well as the international environment, where we have two countries now in our neighborhood who are actually possessing of nuclear weapons. Of course, initially it was only China, but now even Pakistan is possessing the nuclear weapons. So we have to go for it. But at the same time, we are overcoming the risk that may arise from this sort of aggressive posture that could be posed if you don't have a no first use option. So I think this is a very important aspect which we have to underline as to why India has gone in for this projection of a very defensive projection of the nuclear weapons as political tools and not war fighting tools. Because when you have the NFU, that means you are trying to project that this is an NFU which has been somewhat forced upon us, the nuclear weapons are forced upon us, we are not going to use them for war fighting. I mean, that is the type of message you are conveying. Then the next issue is that if you have an NFU, you have got, in the escalation ladder, you have got various steps which can be placed so that you do not use the nuclear weapons in a hurry or nuclear weapons in a huff, and there is adequate cushion for you to exercise various other options, diplomatic and otherwise, to prevent the use of nuclear weapons. So I think this is also a major consideration as far as India is concerned. Being at the lower edge of the escalation ladder assumes much importance from the Indian point of view. And finally, of course, this is a very confidence-building measure with our neighbors who are possessing the nuclear weapons. NFU gives a very high degree of confidence to them that since India will not be the first to use nuclear weapons, they may also not have the requirement of doing so.
India is a responsible nuclear power, and its nuclear thinking and positioning is rooted in the belief that nuclear weapons are purely political instruments for deterrence and not for war fighting. So nuclear weapons, the way it perceives, is to counter the threat of use or threat of nuclear weapons from the adversary, which explains its position on no first use, because this has been the thinking behind the nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons for India is countering the threat of nuclear weapons and not conventional weapons like Pakistan. So no first use is a very, very logical doctrine emerging from this thought process, and the rationale behind no first use is explained by this thought process. The first use doctrine, like Pakistan has, creates tremendous anxiety, and that's what we have seen in Pakistan's posturing now, you know, how it has repeatedly talked about nuclear weapons. Then the railway minister talked about the possibility of a war or the nuclear war. Imran Khan talks about the NFU changing from first use to NFU and then again reversing back to the old position. So you see the restlessness with the first use. On the other hand, a no first use doctrine puts the onus of escalation on the adversary and also allows you to retain the initiative of punitive retaliation.